On All Saints' Eve, exactly 29 years after Pope Julius had consecrated the ceiling with a special ceremony, Pope Paul said High Mass to celebrate the completion of the Last Judgment. On Christmas Day, 1541, the chapel was thrown open to the public. Rome streamed through the Sistine, terrified, shocked, awe-stricken. The studio in the Marcello dei Corvi was thronged with Florentines, cardinals, courtiers, artists, and apprentices. When the last of the guests had disappeared, Michelangelo realized that two groups had not been represented: Antonio da Sangallo and the artists and architects who centered around him, remnants of the Bramante Raphael coterie, and Cardinal Carafa and his followers. Very soon war was declared. An unfrocked monk, Bernardino Ochino, censored Pope Paul by demanding, "How can your holiness allow such an obscene painting as that of Michelangelo's to remain in a chapel where the divine office is sung?" When Michelangelo returned to the Sistine the following day, he found half a dozen artists sitting on low stools, sketching and copying. The Pope rallied to his support by asking him to fresco two virtually 20-foot square walls of the chapel named after him, the Pauline designed and recently completed Antonio da Sangallo between the Sistine and St. Peter's. The chapel was ponderously top-heavy, the two overhead windows affording insufficient light, but the walls were attractively set off by reddish Corinthian pillars. Pope Paul wanted a conversion of Paul on one wall, a crucifixion of Peter on the opposite. While thinking through the imagery of the conversion, Michelangelo spent his days with hammer and chisel. He sculptured a head of Brutus, which the Florentine colony had been urging. He articulated the thick curls on Moses' head, carving at the forefront of the two horns, or rays of light, which the Old Testament attributed to Moses. With the heat of midsummer, he moved two marbles out to the bricked garden terrace from which to carve a Rachel and a Leah, a contemplative and active life for the two niches alongside the Moses. Niches which, in his redesigning of Julius' single-wall tomb, had become too small to hold the heroic captive and dying. Captive. He finished the sketches for the Virgin, Prophet, and Sibyl, which would complete the monument, then sent for Raffaello to da Montelupo, who had carved the Saint Damien for the Medici chapel to sculpture them. With the two captives no longer part of the design and the four unfinished giants and the Victory still in Florence, it was Ercole Gonzaga who was proving to be the prophet. The Moses alone would be the majesty of Julius' tomb and represent his best carving. Was it, as the Cardinal of Mantua had said, sufficient monument for any man? Michelangelo wondered what Jacopo Galli would have said about his finishing the tomb with only one major work of the original 40 he had contracted for. He decided that Urbino had earned his independence. "Urbino, you're past 30 now, and it's time you began making money for yourself. The Pope has agreed to pay you 8 ducats a month for grinding the colors when I paint his chapel. Would you like also to contract for the reconstruction of the tomb wall?" "Yes, Messere, for I must begin putting away money against my marriage. The family that bought my parental home in Urbino, they have a little gift girl. In about 10 years she will make a good wife." He sorely missed Vittoria Colonna. In the deep of night he wrote her long letters, frequently sending a sonnet or a drawing. At first Vittoria replied promptly, but as his letters became more urgent, she answered less frequently. To his anguished cry of "Why?" she replied, "Magnificent Messer Michelangelo, I did not reply earlier to your letter because it was, as one might say, an answer to my last. For I thought that if you and I were to go on writing without intermission, according to my obligation and your courtesy, I should have to neglect the chapel of St. Catherine here and be absent at the appointed hours for company with my sisterhood, while you would have to leave the chapel of St. Paul and be absent from morning through the day. Thus we should both of us fail in our duty." He felt crushed, chagrined, as though he were a small boy who had been reproved. He continued to write passionate poems to her, but did not send them, contenting himself with scraps of news brought by travelers from Viterbo. Then he learned that she was ill and rarely left her room, His sense of mortification turned to anxiety. Did she have good medical attention? Was she taking proper care of herself? He was depleted, tired, at loose ends. Yet all the loose ends had to be tied together securely. He laid a new plaster wall in the Pauline Chapel, deposited 1,400 ducats in the bank of Montota to be paid out to Urbino and Raffaello to Montelupo as they made progress with the tomb. He drew a modest design for the conversion of Paul with some 50 figures, an additional number of faces surrounding Paul as he lay on the ground, having been struck by a shaft of yellow light coming down from heaven, the first New Testament miracle he had ever painted. He carved the Rachel and Leo, two tender, lovely young women, heavily swathed in robes, symbolic figures. And for the first time since the Piccolomini statues, he was carving marbles in which he had no genuine interest. They appeared to him watered down in emotional intensity, without the throbbing, self-contained core of energy to grip and dominate the space about them. His studio and garden had been turned into a busy workshop, with half a dozen young people helping Urbino and Raffaello de Montelupo to finish the tomb. He was delighted to find a number of the Jews of Rome, some of whom reported that they were sons or grandsons of the men who had posed for his first Pietà, asking permission to come to the studio to see the Moses. They stood before the great teacher, caught between pride and wonder, their lips silently murmuring something which Michelangelo knew could not be prayer, since the 10 Commandments forbade it. The present and future had shaped for him. Only in terms of work to be done, how many more works of art could he live? The conversion of St. Paul would take so many years, the crucifixion of St. Peter so many more. Better to count the projects ahead than the days. Then he would not tick off the years one by one as though they were coins he was counting into the hands of a wary merchant. Simpler to think of time as creativity. The 2 Pauline frescoes, then a descent from the cross, he wanted to carve for his own pleasure from the last of his magnificent Carrara blocks. God would not be inclined to interrupt an artist in the midst of begetting. He consumed time as smoothly as he drank a cup of water. A few days represented a servant trying to restrain Paul's frightened horse. A week involved a wingless angel. A month conceived Paul stricken by the light from Christ's hand. A year meant the massing of figures on one side of Paul, soldiers and companions, some terrorized, some trying to flee, some gazing upward in their consternation. What better way to tell the time than through the body of content? A committee of inquisition had been established in Rome. Cardinal Carafa, who had lived a morally upright life as a priest in the corrupt court of the Borgia Pope Alexander VI, had attached power against the will and wishes of those who served him. Though he boasted that he never made himself agreeable to anyone, that he turned away roughly everyone who asked favors, though he was choleric in temperament and painfully thin of face and body, his burning zeal for the dogma of the Church was making him the most influential leader of the College of Cardinals. Respected, feared, and obeyed, his committee of inquisition had already established an index which said what books could be printed and read. Vittoria Colonna returned to Rome and entered the convent of San Silvestro in Capite near the Pantheon. Michelangelo did not think she should have left the safety of Viterbo. He pressed for a meeting. Vittoria refused. He accused her of a cruelty. She replied that it was a kindness. Finally, from sheer persistence, he gained her assent, only to find that her strength and her beauty had been ravaged. Her illness and the pressure of accusations against her had aged her 20 years. She had passed from a lovely, robust, vibrant woman to one whose face was lined, lips dry and pale, the green eyes sunk in their sockets, the rich copper gone from her hair. She was sitting alone in the convent garden, her hands folded in her lap, her head veiled. He was overcome. "I tried to save you from this," she murmured. "You think my love so shallow. Even in your kindness there is a cruel revelation. Life is cruel, never love." Love is the cruelest of all, I know." "You know only a fragment," he interrupted. "Why have you kept us apart, and why have you returned to this dangerous atmosphere?" "I must make my peace with the Church, find forgiveness for my sins against her." "Sins?" "Yes, I disobeyed, indulged my own vain opinions against the divine doctrine, harbored dissenters. His throat locked. Another echo from the past. He remembered the anguish with which he had listened to the dying Lorenzo de Medici pleading for absolution from Savonarola, the man who had destroyed his Plato Academy. He heard again his brother Leonardo's disavowal of Savonarola's disobedience to the Borgia Pope. Was there no unity between living and dying? My last desire to die in grace, Vittoria was saying quietly. I must return to the bosom of the Church, like a child to the bosom of its mother. Only there can I find redemption. Your illness has done this to you, he cried. The Inquisition has tortured you. I've tortured myself inside my own mind. Michelangelo, I worship you as God-given among men, but you too, before your death, will have to seek salvation. He listened to the noise of the bees as they buzzed in the cups of the flowers. His heart ached for her despair. They were still alive on the face of the earth. She spoke as though they were already dead. He said, My feelings for you, which you would never allow me to express, have not changed. Did you think I was a young boy who had fallen in love with a pretty contadina? Do you not know how great a place you occupy in my mind? Tears flooded her eyes. She began breathing rapidly. Thank you, Caro, she whispered. You have healed wounds that go very far back. And she was gone into a side door of the convent, leaving him on the stone bench which suddenly was cold beneath him and a garden cold about him.